Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Lean In New York City's live interview series, Leaning Into the Future of Work, hosted by your New York City network leader, Deborah Albert. Today, Deborah will be speaking with the captivating Michael Cooper, Executive Coach. I'm Michelle Liu, and I'll be moderating today's broadcast with your questions and comments. As usual, a few housekeeping items. Let us know where you're tuning in from. As we've entered 2023, have you implemented any new habits for yourself? What are some goals you want to achieve for this year? What do you want to learn from Deborah and Coop today? Let us know by posting in the comment section. If you liked what you heard, let us know. Tap that like button, click that heart emoji, and comment with your reaction. And now, without further ado, here's Deborah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is definitely going to be a very interesting and informative conversation with Michael Cooper. He's an executive coach with 24 years of experience, coaching over 2,500 executives from 1,000 plus organizations in 37 countries. He's trained over 50,000 employees and helped raise 1.7 billion in funding and still counting. There will be a test after, so make sure you note those numbers. No, just kidding. He's part startup whisperer, people engineer, and executive coach. Coop has helped mid-stage and high-growth organizations solve their toughest leadership challenges so they can grow and scale. He's worked with leaders from Google, Genentech, Facebook, Oracle, eBay, Ralph Lauren, Mars, and has worked with a lot of diverse companies that are pioneering cellular telecommunications, robotic surgery, automating the cure for leukemia, and harnessing wave technology for electricity to reduce smog. Cool stuff. So make sure that your phone, tablet, or paper and pen, whatever, are handy, because I think you're going to want to take some notes. Welcome, Michael. Coop.
So good to be here. Thanks so much, Deborah. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So let's talk. Let's talk a little bit about first how you got into this leadership coaching thing, because I know previously that wasn't your first career. So just give us a little background on that.
So I was a management consultant. We were building large-scale systems. So everything you do with your phone right now that has access to the web and GPS and data, we built that for Vodafone and rolled it out in 37 countries, and worked with lots of different organizations. Back when e-commerce was taking off, building e-commerce systems like Walmart.com, Kmart.com, companies like that. And after that, our company was acquired and we'd gone through 8 rounds of layoffs. And around the same time, my manager brought an article about coaching in from the San Francisco Chronicle and said, I think you'd be great at this and I want to be your first client.
Wow.
And so, total fluke. I had no idea what coaching was, but I was so intrigued that night. I logged on to the only coach training program in the world at the time. There's only one in existence. I enrolled that night, and she paid me in sushi for a year to work together because there has to be a value exchange, and that's how I got started.
Wow, and that was quite a long time ago. Okay, good. All right, so we've established your credibility as a leader and leadership coach. Let's talk about the $1 million question, okay? But in very broad terms, because we'll dive into all of it. What does it take to be an effective leader?
It takes a lot of things. And, if you've ever been through any leadership training, most of them will start off with, you need a vision. And a vision is great to have. But one of the most important skills, and one of the ones that's really lacking, and you said earlier, I worked with 2,500 executives. Of those 2,500, only 3 of the entire 2,500 knows about the importance of psychological safety in their organization. Now, some of the others had heard about it, but really couldn't understand the impact it would have, and particularly their responsibility in creating that psychological safety. So that's one of the very first things you have to, particularly now, because the pandemic changed a lot about leadership and about expectations. Our values shifted during the pandemic. And so Psychological safety, trust, and alignment are the three main components that any leader has to have now. And the good fourth one that I always throw in is problem definition, how to actually define the problems that we're working on. Because so many of us spend 40 to 70% of our time working on poorly defined problems or symptoms of problems or just staying busy. And it's not really
Yeah.
creating value for the organization or for ourselves or for our clients or customers.
Got it. Okay. So psychological safety, trust, problem
Alignment
identification, and alignment.
and
Okay.
alignment.
You
Yeah.
you also talk a lot about culture, and I think not we all know, some people know that I think it's 72% of people who leave their jobs do so because of the leadership and usually their immediate boss.
Very
Talk a
true.
little bit, and we'll get into those three main topics in a minute, but talk about culture because I think that's something that people can really identify with. Like they know that their leaders are creating a bad culture. I don't think that they're thinking about trust, alignment, psychological safety, and problem identification. So let's start with that broad topic first.
So culture is how things get done. It's how things work around here. It's what gets rewarded or who gets promoted, that sort of thing. And it's built every single day using a common language and seeing what people reward or what people might reprimand, that sort of thing. And a lot of it is unspoken. And so we
Mm,
pick up from our environment what the culture is.
mhm.
But the fascinating thing about culture is that we all contribute to it, but a lot of us think leaders are more responsible for the culture than employees. And the
Mhm.
reality is we actually work in two separate cultures. If you're a manager or a leader in an organization, the first day that you got promoted, the people that were your colleagues before that no longer tell you the same things they would have told you when you were a colleague. You're excluded from that, what's called the employee culture at that
Absolutely.
point. Have
Happened
you
to
ever
me.
experienced that yourself?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it does. And it
Definitely.
happens in an instant, right?
Yes.
But most
Yes.
organizations don't realize that there's a separate leadership culture, that everyone who has that management and leadership title, that culture exists. Most people ignore it, don't know it exists, that sort of thing. And it's really critical that the folks who are in that leadership culture have the right skill sets and the knowledge to influence the employee culture. The trouble is, most of them are, if they're a bad leader, if they're a toxic manager, they're influencing it every day in a negative way. But we also are
Mhm.
responsible for influencing it in positive ways. And psychological safety and trust and alignment and problem definition are the four main ways to really influence a culture in a positive way.
Okay.
Does that make
I
sense?
would it does, but I mean I would think without having the kind of experience, knowledge and insights that you do, it always seems to me that it's the leadership that creates the culture. I personally never would have thought, well, there's an employee culture too. So if it's always, it isn't always the employee, as you just said, but I guess if it is the employees for the most part, maybe thinking, rather, I sort of identifying that there's this kind of toxic culture. I mean, I've been both an employee and a leader, and I never hear leaders talking about, oh, we have a toxic culture. So,
Right. Right.
how do, right? So, how do good leaders recognize that there's a toxic culture among the employees? And then how do they go about changing it?
So you can have toxic cultures in the leadership culture. You can have toxic individuals within a leadership culture. You can have toxic individuals within an employee culture or a fully toxic employee culture. There's lots of ways to slice and dice that. It's important to note that the individuals in the culture are what create the culture. And on a daily basis, we tend to just perpetuate what's already there. Most leaders in organizations don't realize they have a toxic culture because they've been rewarded and promoted for
Right.
doing what they do. And a lot of times
Yeah.
those are mildly toxic behaviors or things like that that can create bigger problems in the organization. And so culture change work is some of the hardest work to do because the
Yeah.
leaders in that organization have been rewarded for building the culture that they're in. And in order to change the culture, they have to change themselves. And a lot of people
Right.
just aren't interested in that. And that's really difficult work to do.
Yeah.
And so First off, if you're a leader in an organization and you hear any of your employees say that you've got a toxic culture, it should be a signal to you that there is some toxicity going on, even if you don't recognize it, even if it's not you, even if you're not participating in it. And the truth is, most established organizations have some toxicity in their organization to some degree. And there's a lot of really famous organizations that have huge pockets of toxic culture in those organizations. And, there's lots of reasons why that happens. There's a lot of people who are bad actors, they engage in bad behavior, but they drive revenue. So they're given an excuse. They're given kind of carte blanche to do whatever they want as long as the money keeps coming in, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Or you'll have some subtle behaviors, like you have pockets of organizations where the manager and their employees just don't have rapport. The manager doesn't make the effort. They're not really invested in the human capital that's there, just trying to get the job done. And that department may have a lot of turnover, that sort of thing. And so that signals that there's something going on there that could be toxic. Now, there's no clear definition of what toxic and what's not. A lot of it is how we perceive it, how it feels to us in the moment, and how it feels to us on a daily basis. And so we don't need to debate exactly what the definition is. The reality is we're responsible for creating the culture that we're swimming in on a daily basis. Does that make sense? As leaders, as managers. And for us, that means we need to model the behavior that we expect to see. So a good example is, in great companies, the values are very clear, and the managers there model those behaviors on a daily basis. Now, we're never perfect. We all have bad days. We all have days where we might say something that, can really upset somebody, that sort of thing. But as long as that's not the norm, as long as that, and you try to clean it up when you recognize it happens, then it won't turn into a toxic culture.
Got it. Okay.
But the reality is,
if
you're in an organization, particularly if it's been established for a while, you should assume there is some toxicity there and there's work to do.
I guess that's just because people are people, right? And not everybody, it might not actually be a toxic culture. It might just be that some people aren't the cup of tea for other people. So therefore, they don't really get along. I mean, that's possible.
That's true. Yeah. But we still have to be professional. We have to set people up for success. We have to communicate what's needed to get the job done, those sorts of things. And a lot of organizations, when that doesn't happen, the individual feels like they're set up for failure. And that's another signal for a toxic culture.
Got it. Okay. So let's go back a step, because you talked about psychological safety. And I know that that's one of the key, most, important aspects of being a great leader. Let's dive into that a little bit. So what is it?
So before we get into that, I think it's important to know that everything's contextual. And right now, psychological safety is more important than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. And here's why. I call it's the soup we're swimming in, right? Okay. If you think about what we've been through over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been through a pandemic, there's war, there's anxiety, economic anxiety, like inflation happening, layoffs. We're adjusting to remote work. A lot of people are isolated. There's talk of inflation. A lot of people lost family members, that sort of thing. And so when you're leading an organization where this is our collective reality, you have to understand the impact that has on everyone's psyche and their ability for really focus and bandwidth. And the reality is, most of us don't have the same bandwidth that we had 3 or 4 years ago. The truth is, we've been through what the pandemic is really traumatic for us. Big, huge changes overnight, that sort of thing. And that recovering from that trauma may take years for all of humanity to do. We'll all do it at different time frames and on our own. Yeah, we'll all do it at different time frames and on our own path. But collectively, as a species, we just don't have as much bandwidth because we're still dealing with all those changes and the fear of the unknown for the future. We don't know what the next normal is going to be like, particularly given the financial anxiety, that sort of thing that we're experiencing right now. And so it's important to note that when there's this, I call it the cognitive emotional load that we're under.
Say it again, the cognitive emotional load?
cognitive emotional load.
Okay.
So all the things we're trying to keep track of and we're trying to accomplish, and then all the emotions from everything that's going on around us, our brains have to process all that, deal with that. And if that's extremely high, or if there's a lot going on for most of the people in your organization, that usually means they need higher levels of psychological safety, meaning they need to feel safer. They need to feel like they're supported more, versus, just get the job done. It doesn't matter if you have the right tools or resources or those sorts of things. That's kind of a toxic environment, right? So
yeah, right.
Because we've been through so much, we actually need higher levels of psychological safety.
That
Does that make
makes
sense?
a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah. So
And there will
there's
be periods
actually,
in the future where we don't need as much because we've collectively recovered. We understand for the next 2 or 3 years. We know what our goals are. We know where we're headed, unless there's another big pandemic or emergency, that sort of thing that we're dealing with.
that's interesting, because it doesn't make sense to me that you think it might revert back a bit. I get why it's changed now, because, all these people dying all over the place, people starting to reassess their
Right.
values and really what they want out of their lives. That makes sense. But it's interesting to me that you think that, well, maybe that'll subside a little bit, because then I'm guessing you mean it'll be all about the dollar again, or whatever currency. And
that's
just
always
about,
the case in business, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So it would be kind of a shame to lose the humanity part of what good leadership should be, based on what you're saying. Yeah.
I totally agree with
So how
that.
do
And
we?
one of the things that we really focused on is really what we call human-centric leadership. And that's why psychological safety is the really most important thing. And we can go into what psychological safety means, and then
Yes,
trust and
please.
alignment builds on top of that. And so
Okay.
psychological safety is it's really based on how we feel, but there's 4 stages to it. And this is work done by Jeffrey Clark. There's a great book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, if anyone's interested in resources for this. And it's really based on how much respect we're shown by the people that are our managers and leaders, and how much permission we have to do what we think is necessary or right. And so if we have too much permission, Michelle, you can go ahead and jump forward here a little bit. If we have too much permission, it's called paternalism, which is if we give too much respect, we're really kind of infantilizing people. We're restricting their freedom. If we give them too much permission, it's kind of like exploitation. And so before we go to work for an organization, we don't feel like we're part of the organization. We live in what's called exclusion at that point. We might be a customer, we might understand their brand, but we're not really part of the team, that sort of thing. And the very first stage of psychological safety is called inclusion safety. And it's when we really become a member of the team. I feel like I belong. I feel like I'm respected for being here. I feel like I can really kind of know what I'm supposed to do to make a difference around here. That's what inclusion safety is. Okay. And then after that, once we really are welcomed onto the team fully, for most of us, we haven't performed the roles that we're in, or if we have, we performed in other organizations. And so we have to learn how things work around here, what's really required from this job. And the second stage in psychological safety is called learner safety. And learner safety really means we were set up for success. We're able to make mistakes. And I always say we're obligated to learn from those mistakes, hopefully. But we have the right resources to learn our jobs. We have the right mentoring, coaching, support, training, resources, so that we're really set up for success. In a lot of organizations, particularly smaller organizations, they don't always have the resources to set a lot of their team members up for success, right? And so sometimes learner safety can be hard. Yeah, it can be really difficult, and it means you're figuring out on your own. And often, if you find yourself in that case as an employee, it's important to check in with your manager or leader. Am I doing this the right way? Can you give me more feedback? Those sorts of things. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of guessing what success looks like, or if you're meeting expectations.
Well, also,
on the flip side,
you talked about clarity, right? And clarity in their roles and responsibilities. That sounds to me like, if you can't afford, big training companies and the like, At least be clear on what you want these people to do. And then if they make mistakes, you as the manager have to show them the better way. Yeah.
Absolutely. You have to give them the proper materials and resources and everything to set them up for success. Tell them what your expectations are. And if they don't meet those expectations, communicate again and then coach them through how to change or adapt, that sort of thing. Sometimes it means you need to show them as the leader too. Modeling behavior is really critical for leadership. And, a lot of times if employees work for you and they know that you don't know how to do their job, then sometimes they think, well, then how am I supposed to know how to do my job? Because no one can really paint the picture of what success looks like for me. Right. And so that's an awkward position for employees to be in.
I got to ask you on a little bit of a personal note. So I used to own a training company. We trained people all over the world in product management, that job function. And everyone nods their head to me and says, oh, yeah, product management. Well, we had a company because it's not really a well understood job function and it's carried out totally inconsistently. There were a ton of product managers who basically felt like their bosses had no clue what it really was. And so besides not being able to help your employee, how do you deal with that perception that the employee might have of, oh, come on, I know it better than you do. Why are you the manager and not me?
And so for some managers and leaders, that's entirely appropriate. As long as it doesn't affect your relationship with your employee. You can also show an interest, try to understand as much as possible. You can even ask your employee to teach you, which I know for a lot of people is a vulnerable position. Yeah, but if you need a grounding in the domain to understand if your employee is doing well and your employee can provide that, then it's a very important thing for you to do and show that vulnerability. By the way, vulnerability really builds trust. Shows that you provide psychological safety for other people to learn if you're learning in front of them. And so it's a big two-way street here.
That makes sense.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. What's stage 3?
And so after learner safety, after we're set up to really learn our jobs and make mistakes and take risks, that sort of thing, then it's contributor safety. And you'd be surprised how many people don't have what's called stage 3 contributor safety. And that is, I can fully own my job. I can fully own my responsibilities. My manager's not micromanaging. They're not holding on to part of my job because it's something that they like to do or familiar with. They're getting out of my way. Really, if you're a great leader, your job, as long as you've got the right employee with the right skill set in the right job, your job should be, as a leader and manager, to move things out of their way, to remove their blockers and barriers and basically get the heck out of their way so they can do it even better than you might do it or anybody else. And so that's what contributor safety is really about. It's really removing those barriers and blockers and letting someone fully inhabit their role. And then that moves into stage 4, which is challenger safety. Challenger safety is when we're able to make changes in an organization. We're able to push back on the status quo. We're able to suggest new ways of doing something or innovation or changing things. Now, interestingly enough, Michelle, I'm going to have you fast forward one more step. If you don't have challenger safety, and this is really critical for you in organizations now, doesn't matter what size your organization is, doesn't matter where you work, is if you don't have challenger safety, you can't innovate. You're so stuck in your sacred cows and the past ways of doing something. We've always done it this way. That you're not really giving your team the opportunity to reimagine your organization. Let's just say for right now, lots of people are going through digital transformation. If you haven't done your full digital transformation yet, and you're not listening to your employees for how we might, take this online or automate this or that sort of thing, then you're really not providing that challenger safety. You're not saying we can make things different. We can make things better. We can innovate around here. Now, one of the most important things oh, sorry to interrupt there.
No, I was just saying it makes sense.
One of the most important ways to build challenger safety is to give your employees direct permission to disagree with you, to make suggestions, to make improvements. Now, a lot of people get into roles and they tell everybody, I have an open door. You can make all the suggestions you want. And then whenever somebody makes a suggestion, they shut it down. Well, we can't do that, or we don't have budget, or we don't have time for that sort of thing. And it's important to note that you think you're reacting just to that specific situation in the moment. But the message you're sending the entire team, and I apologize for that ringing in the background. The message you're sending the entire team is that you can't really, even though I said I want your ideas, only when they're convenient, only when it's not difficult to do. And so it shuts down challenger safety in pretty significant ways. Now, it's important to know in a leadership position, you're never going to be able to accept every suggestion or change that everybody brings forward.
Sure.
And so the most important thing is to listen. So if somebody says, I have a suggestion, instead of just shutting it down or saying, we don't have time or can't do that, just say, I'd love to hear it. Let me think about it, and I'll have to get back to you. Most people understand if you have a rational explanation and you've given it some consideration, they're totally fine hearing a no. But if it's an instant shutdown, if it's a rejection in the moment, then it shows that challenger safety doesn't really exist.
I would say psychological safety in general doesn't exist if you get shut down so immediately. It's like, I don't value your opinion. Why are you taking my time? True. Can I just tell you?
Yet, so many leaders do that on a daily basis and think nothing of it, just because they're busy, they're overwhelmed. And so Google says that psychological safety is the #1 predictor of success. Harvard Business Review says that psychological safety is the #1 requirement for high performance and innovation, both. And so for most organizations who are being disrupted in ways, or they're, a lot of, I think it's projected that 40% of organizations that are in business right now won't be in business by 2030 due to automation, due to AI, due to lots of things like that. And so, it's important to note that it doesn't matter what type of business you have right now, because values are changing so much and technology is changing so fast, that we have to innovate no matter what type of business we're in.
Right.
Otherwise, we won't survive.
Right. That makes sense. But may I just say that it's true what you said about a lot of businesses are not going to exist. They certainly aren't going to exist unless they innovate, right, and change. And some will just not exist anyway, because these new technologies are going to create a whole different paradigm. So don't quote me on my exact numbers, but I think it's something like 53 million jobs will be gone by 2030, but there'll be 121 million new types of jobs, some of which are not even on our radar yet. So I don't want anybody to get scared out there. And also, that's why we run this series. It's called Leaning Into the Future of Work. We do a lot about technologies that are coming into fray and helping people get a good understanding of them. But even if you have great technology, if you have bad leadership, it's not going to work, right?
I always say you can have the best technology in the world, but if you have a toxic culture, which is the result of bad leadership, you're not going anywhere. Your technology is not going to be able to do anything because you're not going to be able to scale. You've got so many problems internally. You're not going to be able to innovate. You're not going to be able to introduce products enough. You're not going to be able to adapt to the market as quickly as you need to. And so toxic culture, like, it's cultural debt, the same thing as technical debt. Over time, you have to rewrite code because all sorts of APIs and things change. Well, technical debt is just this backlog of things you've got to clean up in the technology stack of your organization. Same thing happens in the cultural side of your organization.
That's interesting. I guess as people come and go too, depending upon the hiring managers and their sort of, I don't know what the right word is, their sense of who they want to hire, the culture can shift, right? Because it's all based on people.
Absolutely.
So
every new person that enters a culture shifts the culture to some degree.
Okay, that's fair. I have a question from the audience, and that is, because it's kind of related, how can employees help leaders remain connected with employees' reality?
Well, a couple things. First off, there are a lot of employees who aren't comfortable sharing that. And so if you're not, and there's all sorts of reasons for doing that, but if employees aren't willing to share their reality, then the leaders can't be connected to it. And so I think it's important that, there's lots of reasons where you may not be comfortable sharing everything with your manager, but you should start to share some things that you're comfortable with. And then maybe that can grow over time to really let them know what your reality is. Now, they should ask in your one-on-ones. If your one-on-ones is really about the status of your work. Yes,
sorry,
absolutely.
The leader should ask. Okay, it's incumbent
the
upon
leader
them.
should ask.
Yeah.
But if they don't, it's important for you to still inject that into the conversation, to let your manager know how you're doing, what you're dealing with, if you have limited bandwidth, if and look, I know some of those can reflect on performance. But the reality is if you don't communicate it, it's going to reflect on performance more, right? Hopefully you have an understanding manager who has a lot of compassion for what you're dealing with, and they want to try to support you as much as possible.
How do you not come off as whining, though? How do you not come off as whining?
It's important to note that some people are going to hear your reality as whining, even if you're not whining, right? And so sometimes we can't change that.
Toxic people.
That's not everybody. Right. Okay. That's not everybody. And usually the most important thing about leaders is when they start hearing everything's a complaint, usually it means it's a signal that they're really stressed out. And as long as they're under really high levels of stress, and this goes for everybody, whether you're an employee or a manager or leader, if you're under high levels of stress, you're not acting in your best way, if that makes sense. You're not treating people as well as you should. You're not being the best leader that you can. Your individual contributor work is not, the quality is not there, that sort of thing. And so I know a lot of us spend a lot of time under stress. We all know it's not healthy. And one of the things that organizations have to do, and why psychological safety is so important, is that it reduces a significant amount of stress when we have psychological safety. When I know that I belong, that I can learn and make mistakes, I can take risks, I can really fully own my job, and I can make suggestions for change and push back and disagree. It's a very different reality than most people experience. And so I always go back to that as the basis for real performance and people being able to contribute in ways that are meaningful to them, and also build the type of relationships that we need with our managers and employees.
That makes sense. Talk to me a little bit about marginalized communities, because I understand it makes sense that if they're marginalized throughout their lives, not just at work, it must be really hard to be seen and heard and valued if there's all these biases running around. Yeah. So how does that play?
There are, and there's lots of people. So full disclosure, I'm a gay man. For gay people, for people of color, for women, for marginalized folks, for natives, trans, LGBTQ, the truth is a lot of us don't feel safe anywhere or most places. And so psychological safety in an environment and an organization is even more critical for marginalized groups, because we don't experience it when we're walking down the street. Usually we don't feel safe walking into an environment where everyone looks different than we do, or they have a different religion or a different sexuality, or those sorts of things. When we feel like we don't really fit in and aren't accepted, we have lower levels of psychological safety already. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And if you're a leader and manager, it's important to note that that's the reality. If you're from a marginalized group, that could be your reality. And psychological safety, the beauty of it is we all need it to perform well. It doesn't matter what our color is. It doesn't matter what our background is. It doesn't matter what our sexuality is. And so the beautiful thing for leaders is you don't have to worry about those things. If you were great at providing psychological safety for everybody, it's going to help those that are marginalized even more. And we tell folks, so we run a training class, which I know we'll get to eventually. We always tell everybody, if you're a leader, you might be the one person that creates a safe environment for somebody for the very first time in their lives. And that is an awesome responsibility. And hopefully, if you're a leader, that's what you aspire to do, right? Those are the types of leaders we want to follow.
Yeah, that would be fabulous if everybody could go there. Let's get into a couple of other areas that you talked about as sort of, I'll say, pillars of great leadership. So we talked about psychological safety. Let's talk about alignment, because it's a word that's thrown around the corporate world, which I have been a part of for many years, a lot. And I think people use it along with a lot of lip service. So what does it
Usually as
really
a
mean?
buzzword.
That's funny that you did that when you said buzzword. I thought maybe something was buzzing in your ear. Exactly. No, I did. I really did. Yeah, it's like a buzzword. Like, oh, we're going to build alignment. Where do you go from there to make
So
it
alignment's
real?
critical. The building blocks, we start with psychological safety, and then there's trust, and then there's alignment. I'm happy to talk about alignment now, but if we don't trust each other, it's really difficult to get aligned. Alignment, though, really means that we're willing to stand behind a decision, even if I would have made a different decision. It means I'm not going to block it. I'm not going to complain about it. I'm not going to slow walk it. I'm not going to put any barriers in place. I'm going to be fully on board with this decision. It takes a level of maturity to get alignment, to be aligned with something that you might have done differently if you were in charge or if you got to make the final decision. And so what happens when we're not aligned, though, is that we end up working cross purposes. So let's just say that you and I agree that we've got a goal, and all we do is agree on the goal. We're going to make $100 million this year, whatever it is. And you say, great, I'm going to take care of my part. You go take care of your part. We come back 2 weeks later and I find out you're working on something completely different than I expected you to. It doesn't align with what I'm doing. I'm doing something that's probably counter to what you're doing. And so a lot of people go into conversations and they get agreement, but they don't get alignment, meaning here's what we're going to do together. Here's my part in that. Here's your part in that. Here's where that comes together. Here's where we're all working towards. That's what alignment really means, is we're all pulling in the same direction.
And everybody's clear about their responsibility in that goal or in that direction.
Correct.
And agrees to it, right?
Right. And one of the things that we try to do, I run a company called Modern Leaders, and I had an old company called Innovation Influencers. We're going through a rebrand now. But one of the things we really try to do is a lot of these topics can sound vague, theoretical, difficult. The reality is we've broken alignment down to an 8-step process. It's a really simple 8 steps. First off, we have to have a conversation. You cannot get alignment via email. You can't do it via Slack. You can't do it via any asynchronous communication.
Hold on. Do we have a slide on that? I don't think so. That would be a good one.
I think
we do. A slide.
I think it's a couple more forward, Michelle.
We'll get into trust.
We can talk about trust if you want. We'll come back to trust.
Okay, we'll come back. Anyway, all right. 8 steps to alignment. No email.
And
face-to-face?
No email. Has to be face-to-face. It can be by phone. It can be by Zoom. It can be.
Okay, I was going to say remote. In a COVID world.
As long as there's dialogue, there must be a give and take. You know, traditionally, when executives would want alignment, is they would go into a room, give a huge presentation, and think, okay, you're all aligned. But what happens there? No one can really ask the hard questions. Everyone's afraid to push back on the CEO. Everyone just kind of says, okay, we'll do it. So we get tacit agreement in the conversation. But we don't get any ownership because no one can ask questions. No one can pick it apart. No one can suggest changes or improvements. And no one really understands how it's going to impact them because they don't go to that level of detail in the conversation.
Got it.
So what we try to do is break alignment down to a very simple conversational cycle. And so we'll step through these really quickly. First off, you got to have a conversation. It has to be dialogue. And then there has to be an acknowledgement. Step number 2 is we have to acknowledge that we're going to work on something together. Either that's a goal or a problem or an outcome or an expectation. But if we don't have that acknowledgement, all we're doing is just having a nice conversation. We're not really moving forward to collective action. Once we have that acknowledgement, then we move to agreement that, okay, there's something we need to work on and we all agree that that's the thing. This is going to be our problem. This is going to be our goal. This is going to be our outcome. And that acts as a real focusing mechanism for the conversation. It should help you eliminate distractions and undermine topics, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Once we agree we're going to solve a problem, then we have to create a plan to solve it. And so here's a really big pointer for everybody on the call. If you don't have a plan, if there's a plan not in place, you don't have alignment. And the reality is, like we were saying earlier, you could go do what you want to do and I go what I want to do, but if they don't line up, we don't have alignment. We're not really working together for a common outcome. We might be busy hoping we'll land at a common outcome, but until that plan is in place, we don't really know if we have alignment or not. And
until people follow it.
We don't need a formal
Right.
Exactly, right. And I'll get to that in a moment. We start to get alignment here in the planning process, but we don't fully have alignment yet. And it really depends on the level of detail that you need in your plan. For some of us, we need a 78-page plan with action items for every person and due dates for every person and that sort of thing. For a startup, you don't have the luxury of doing that. And I work with a lot of startup organizations. And so high-level plans can be great. And a lot of those organizations, they get alignment every single day instead of doing it once a year or once every 5 years or whatever it is. And so this cycle has to be something that you can do quickly. It can be conversational, and it should feel natural if you follow the steps of the cycle. And so after we plan, then we have to really start to execute. We have to have a commitment. Sorry, before we get to execute, this is what a lot of people do. They kind of agree and then they jump into execution. But depending on the outcome, so if I worked on, a giant program called the Wireless Web Platform, everything you do on your phone today that I mentioned earlier, that's a giant project with 375 people working on it. We needed formal commitment for everyone, so they knew what the outcome was, they knew what their part was. We actually had everybody sign a sheet of paper saying, I am aligned with this project and the goals assigned to me. Now, you don't need that for everything, but the level of formality in your commitment will vary based on how important the project is, how many people are involved, and how high the stakes are for the outcome.
That's fair.
Once you commit, and sometimes it's, is everybody on board? If if nobody says no, then you can assume you've got commitment. You don't need to be really formal about these things.
Okay.
But once we go from commitment, then it's about execution. And execution, we don't need to belabor. It's basically do what you said you're going to do. There should be a plan in place, execute to the plan. You don't have to really focus on that a lot. And back in the planning process, we also have to create measurements, which is outcomes. What are we expecting? And so the next step is to measure. We have to identify the measures in the plan process, and then we measure at the end. And then the final step in alignment is to refine. If the project isn't complete and it's not wildly successful, meaning exceeding your expectations, what do we need to change? What do we need to go back to? And like I was saying earlier, some organizations have to align on a daily basis. I know organizations that work in emergency management and things like that. They have to align multiple times a day on what they're trying to achieve. Or, if the situation changes, you have to change your approach. You might have to get alignment again when the situation changes.
Interesting. I can see how this really is a very cyclical kind of happening. Right? Because it's kind of like after you do all these steps, I'll call it a win-loss analysis. You'll go back and you decide or think about where did things not go so well? Where did they go well? How can we do it better next time? Which then starts this whole process of conversation again.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense.
And the truth is, we don't know if we're aligned until we get to the measurement piece. Did we hit our goals or exceed it? If we did, then we were aligned. If we didn't, we were misaligned somewhere along the way.
Better not to be and just do it right. Right. That makes sense. Just do it right from the get-go. Okay. So we talked about psychological safety and alignment, but you just said that alignment was really built on trust. So how do you go about building trust? I think you said you have an 8-step process or something, or an 8-step something.
There are 8 dimensions to trust. And I'll go through it. Instead of just going through all the 8 dimensions and describing which one, I'll take a little bit of a different approach. I'll explain to you how you become trustworthy. And so let's put the slide up with all 8 up there. And how we become trustworthy with people around us is, first off, we have to show that we're on the same team, that we're working towards something that we agree is in our mutual common best interests.
Uh-huh.
And what that means for me is that I can't be selfish. I can't just look out for myself and only my needs. I have to work toward your needs or our team's needs or the goal business's needs, that sort of thing. And that's really called benevolence. And so if you demonstrate benevolence, it's easy for people to trust you more. Does that make sense? If you know
Absolutely.
that people are acting in your shared best interest, you're much more likely to trust them. And particularly if you're a leader or manager, if your employee thinks that you care about them personally, meaning you care about their personal health, happiness, and well-being, and you show that by, you could say, I don't really care if you have to work all weekend. Well, that's not really caring personally about people's mental health and that sort of, and we all have periods where we have to do that. But if somebody shows that they care about you personally, is it easier to trust that person?
Sure.
For most people, they would say yes to that. And so if we can show benevolence and care personally, those two are what I call the gatekeeper values or gatekeeper dimensions. And basically, if those aren't in place, the reality is it's going to be really hard for us to trust you. If you're not on our team and we're not working towards the same goals and you don't care about my personal health, happiness, and well-being, then I probably shouldn't trust you, right? Or at least be a little suspicious until I get more information, right?
Okay.
Now, when the other dimensions all build on each other, and they're really based on how we work as a team. And so in an organization, we would have you evaluate each of these 8 dimensions for every person that you worked with to identify where your trust issues might be. But how it works in a team environment is if we think our coworkers have the competence, they have the skills and motivation to do what their job says and what they've agreed to do and what we've aligned to do, then it's much easier to trust them. If we think they don't have the skills, if we've seen they don't have the skills in the past, if we've seen they haven't delivered in the past, or they've got missing big skill gaps, that sort of thing, we shouldn't trust them as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Everything you're saying makes sense, Coop.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. But one of the things that, a lot of times we think about is we don't even assess people's competence. Subconsciously we do, but we don't think about, should I trust this person? Based on what they've done in the past, should I trust them or not? The reality is a lot of people will tell you, you have to trust everybody you work with. I'm the opposite. There's a lot of people you shouldn't trust, particularly if they've given you reason to trust them, right?
Okay.
And this really comes from human nature. This is, once we have benevolence and we care personally, we know they're competent, it's much easier to trust them. And then we move to integrity. Do they do what they say they're going to do? In the past, have they done what they said they were going to do? If not, if they're blowing smoke, if they tend to be a liar, if they tend to overpromise and underdeliver, or they're all talk and no action, then it's really hard to trust someone.
Absolutely.
And so integrity is the next dimension. And then we build on
it's one of my most important values, for sure, of anything.
Integrity?
For sure. Yeah.
Same here.
That's just me.
Same here. I have a no asshole rule in my business, and usually the asshole rule is about integrity.
I love it. You should write a book about that. The no
Somebody else already
rule.
wrote that.
Oh, they did? Okay.
They
All
did,
right.
yeah. And so we build on trust from there. And once we know that somebody can do the job, they've got the skills and motivation, and they do what they say they're going to do, then we look for results. Do they deliver? Do they actually say, meet the expectations or deliver past those? If they've got a history of doing that in the past, it's much more likely that we're going to believe that they'll deliver on this project or goal or outcome that we're working on.
Right.
And the next one is a little bit about style more than anything else, but sincerity is, does a person that we're working with, do they use the right tone and gravity, or do they dance around issues or not claim responsibility for a mistake that they had or that sort of thing? The reality is we're all here to get work done, to get something accomplished, hopefully to create value for customers, to make their lives better. That's where, or solve their problems. And so I'm not saying we have to walk around and be totally serious all the time, but when it comes down to really the business transactions that we have with each other. We should be sincere. We should treat it as a business.
Sure.
We should use the right tone, gravity, information, and convey that.
Hey, Coop, can I interrupt you for a sec, please? I guess I just
Sure.
did. Because we only have 10 minutes. And I'm just imagining that a lot of people out there are thinking, duh, you know, like, of course you want to see results. Of course you want to have integrity. You want to be reliable, because if you're if what you're working on is part of a project where there are dependencies, that's all got to happen. And that's not even just about leadership. That's about creating a great team. Just real quickly, because I want to get on to some other things as well.
Yeah.
How do you, I guess it's in your training and in your code. I'm answering my own question. Like, how do you make this a reality? How, you know, if people are not benevolent, then how do you make them more benevolent? I guess the answer is in training and coaching. And
It's some
have
of
to
that,
be
but
willing
even on
also,
benevolence. Right? Absolutely. They definitely have to be willing. You and I can't change anybody else, even though we would love to, I'm sure, most days.
Yeah.
But for benevolence, as an example, let's just say that's not present on your team. You haven't agreed on what's in your shared best interest. You can have a conversation. You can actually brainstorm together. You can actually create a list of, you know, here's our values, or here's how we're going to treat each other. Here's what's in our best interest for this project, or that sort of thing. And so most important thing about this is, you know, a lot of times when we think about trust, this is funny about teaching trust in organizations. Most organizations are terrified to talk about trust.
Because they don't want to admit, right, that they don't trust people.
They don't want to admit they have trust issues, but 95% of people say they're aware of trust issues in the organization. But it's really awkward to talk about it. And when we have trust issues, traditionally, we don't know how to resolve those. And so we use the 8 dimensions of trust to show how to build trust every day, but it's also a diagnostic tool. And so if you can look at, we have everybody evaluate, so benevolence on a score of 1 to 5. Deborah, would you give me a score of 1, which is low, or a score of 5, which is high, or anywhere in between?
Got it.
And once you do that analysis, you're able to really then go to the deeper patterns that contribute to why am I having a trust issue with this person, and how do I resolve it? What we have to do is we have to have a very specific conversation. But if we don't know what the pattern is that's underlying the trust issue, then we can't have the conversation about it. And so it has to be a process of diagnosing where the pattern is in order to resolve the issue. We try to make it really simple, straightforward, and accessible.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and this is a good segue, actually, I was thinking as you're talking, like, wow, I guess psychologists and psychiatrists would make great leaders because they're aware of so many of these kind of underlying thoughts and values, and et cetera. There's a lot of data around the differences between men and women, right? In terms of their leadership style, their leadership skills, or the outcomes of their leadership. I saw a quote recently, and I forget it, so I won't bother with it. But actually, I want to tell the audience, you know, Lean In is all about getting rid of the gender gap in leadership. And I forget the data off the top of my head, but I have a lot of it. And so does Michael, with a lot more of his insights from the work that he does. We're going to get together in this coming days and put together a list for everyone of a lot of good statistics on the gender gap, because I think we're both really interested in making that much smaller than it is right now. So that you registered, you will get it. But let's talk for a moment about the differences between men and women. And why is it that they say women make better leaders, and yet the percentage of leadership by women is much smaller?
It is much smaller. And, you know, I work with a lot of startups, and I think the funding for women in startups is about $5 billion a year. And for men, it's $195 billion. So it's almost a 40-to-1 difference, which is completely insane. But the amazing thing about research that came out over the last couple of years with women-run organizations, if you have more women in the executive suite than normal, is that they are more profitable. There's more socially responsible. They have there's safer environments. So we're talking about psychological safety, particularly when it comes to sexual harassment and that sort of thing. They're much safer when women are on board seats, those sorts of things. And they also have higher quality customer experiences. And so the beautiful thing about women in business is that, and you know, Lean In is an example of this. Women collaborate more. They support each other more. Now, I know that there is that societal story where women tear each other down, that sort of thing. And, you know, that still exists in places. But the fact that most women really do want to support each other, they are more collaborative. It shows in the bottom line of businesses. It also shows in the culture of businesses too. The truth is, if you go to most toxic cultures, they're run by men.
Wow.
I'm
what
sure
a great plug for Lean In.
That are toxic, right?
You're going to be our new Lean In poster child. I have just a couple of other questions. There's so much more we can talk about. And I'm excited to be able to give our audience some really good information about this. I was curious though, when, you know, a lot of people read leadership books by people like Seth Godin, Gladwell, who else am I thinking of? Oh, Peter Drucker, or even, you know, some famous politicians, Nelson Mandela. How is leadership today, and we only have 4 minutes, how is leadership today different from the kinds of leadership that was spoken about a long time ago / pre-COVID?
So leadership always has to be contextualized in the time in which you're leading, right? And so I think the most important thing is the fundamentals of leadership roughly stay the same. The reality is psychological safety was always important. We just didn't call it that until 1993 when Amy Edmondson coined the term, that sort of thing. And so now we have a framework for it that we didn't have before, but it was always important. But the fascinating thing is, you know, we've got 5 generations in the workforce that we've never had before. And particularly for Gen Y and Gen Z, their values are very different than Gen X and baby boomers and even the silent or the traditionalists. And so that's something that's really fascinating. We've never had this many people from 5 generations working together in so many different companies around the globe. Yeah. And those value clashes that are happening are very present. And so first off, you got to understand that that's a new reality. The other thing that happened during the pandemic is that people's values shifted. You know, a lot of people renovated their homes. They wanted, you know, better nesting where they live, that sort of thing, all sorts of reasons. But the other thing that happened is a lot of people, their values shifted around their ambition. And they don't necessarily want as big a life as they had before. They don't necessarily want to climb the corporate ladder the way they did before, that sort of thing. And that, you know, that's not widespread yet, that sort of thing, but it's an interesting socioeconomic kind of lens to look at. And so what Nelson Mandela did years ago, what, you know, Colin Powell did, you know, those are all great leaders and they would do well today, but they probably wouldn't be prepared for the demographic shifts that are happening. They also probably wouldn't be prepared for the number of job changes, meaning you were saying all those jobs that are going to go away, but totally new fields, that sort of thing. And so leaders today have to be able to navigate what are we usually much shorter planning cycles. Like you used to, you know, when I started off in corporate America, you had a 5 or 10 year plan. If you have a 3-year plan now, that's kind of amazing. And most people, you know, the last 2 to 3 years in that, not reliable at all. It's probably going to change dramatically by the time you get there, that sort of thing. And so that's
everything's moving so quickly.
Really different. Right. And the disruption that we're experiencing, innovation everywhere. And so that means that leaders have to be more agile. It means when you've got to be more agile, you've got to have higher levels of psychological safety, trust, and alignment so that you can change and adapt really quickly, those sorts of things. And so that's why those are really the new rules of leadership. They've always been important, but particularly now, and particularly what's happening with AI and automation. And, you know, I'm working with autonomous vehicle companies and, you know, automating the cure for leukemia. Like what that's going to change over the next 5 to 10 years is pretty dramatic. And we're going to have all sorts of disruptions for that leaders now really aren't prepared for. And there'll be
that makes sense.
too.
Yeah. for sure, that we can't even know right now. We are basically
Right.
out of time. One more thing.
It
What
went really
is your
fast.
favorite? What is your, just different kind of question? What is your favorite leadership quote? By whom and why?
The favorite one is actually by Peter Drucker, and it's only three things happen in an organization: confusion, friction, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's so critical because when people are left, when they don't really have leadership, there's usually a lot of confusion. There's usually a lot of friction. And so if
Right.
you want to be in leadership, if you want to be an executive, really focusing on psychological safety, trust, and alignment and problem definition will be the most important skills you can have because it will address that friction, confusion, and underperformance.
That was exactly one of my questions. And since we're out of time, I'm going to just say very quickly, this is not a forum. Oh, thank you, Michelle. This is not a forum to plug someone's business. Okay. However, let me tell you how I met Coop. Someone and I think it's important to know because it's really what Lean In is all about. Everybody leaning in to support each other. So Lily Hahn, one of the members of my specific Lean In circle, came to me, I don't know, 8 months ago or so, and she said, I just took this incredible leadership accelerator program. I might not have the name right, but we don't have a lot of time.
That's right. Yeah.
And okay, great. And Coop is doing all of us a really huge favor. Michelle, you want to put up the website? He's giving scholarships to his accelerator program. It's a 10-week program. And Lily said it was one of the best learning environments, learning situations. No, she did. That's why you're here, because she said you were so amazing and I trust her.
She's awesome. It's really great to have her in the workshop.
Yeah. So it's 10 weeks. It ain't easy. But
it's hard.
Coop is giving away some scholarships. I don't know if you've decided how many, it doesn't matter. Go to the website. And is there a scholarship application or something on the website, Coop? Great.
So two things. Okay. There's a for everyone from Lean In that goes to the website today, there's automatically a scholarship there. It's $800 off. We also do full scholarships. And so if you check the box that you're from a marginalized community, we will review your application to see if you qualify. We're probably going to choose 3 to 4 full scholarships this time. And we'll also consider you for future scholarships. If you're not selected for this cohort, you're still in the pool for future cohorts.
Wow, that's terrific. Anyway, it comes extremely highly recommended by someone in my circle. And again, please know, I do not use these interviews as a forum for selling anybody's stuff, but that he's giving away even free scholarships, I felt it was appropriate to let you all know that you can have that. So with that, we are so out of time.
Can I just say why we're doing it, just really quick? I know you're out of time. The main reason we're giving scholarship is we need more women in leadership. We need more people of color in leadership. We need more trans, bi, gay, native, you name it. Marginalized groups, we need to lead because there's no way that the leaders we have now who built toxic cultures almost everywhere, they're not going to change. We have to take the leadership reins and create the change that we need to see.
That's an excellent reason. It really is. And I hope people take you up on it. Coop, thanks. This has been great. And to everybody who's been listening in, thank you so much. Coop and I will get some interesting data to you. And I hope you felt like you learned something. And that's it for tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Coop. Thanks, Michelle.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Be in touch. Talk soon.
Bye.